It's absolutely typical that I sit down to record and the neighbours decide they're going to point their house. I'm sorry if the lighting's not the best. I normally record basically where I'm getting the natural light, but yeah, I put the camera down and neighbours decided workmen were coming and going to point the house, so we're in the corner of my office. It's all good. But anyway, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you've never been here before. So I want to talk about writing vivid descriptions without overwriting. So as writers, we often struggle, or I know I do, with the balance between painting a vivid picture and basically just over describing everything. And description is probably the one thing that really brings a story to life. And if you can hit this on the head and get it great, it creates such a great vivid story for your readers. So I just want to talk about some of the tips that I use to kind of make my description good, but without like over describing everything and overwhelming my readers with just all this purple prose that really is not needed. So to have good descriptions in our work and not over describe everything, we really need to focus on the specific details. So one of the big keys to good description is selectivity. Instead of trying to describe everything in a scene, like from the character, the setting, or even an object, focus on the significant details that will resonate with your readers. And what is important in your scene? What is it that you need to get your readers to understand for them to read this scene and to move forward with the story? What will evoke the right emotions in your characters or the right atmosphere for your story? By carefully choosing a few powerful details, you can create strong images in your reader's mind without just bogging them down with lots and lots of description. And so I'll try and give you an example of a overwritten scene. So the old man's face was wrinkled with deep lines around his eyes and mouth. His nose was slightly crooked and his thin lips were chapped. His grey hair was sparse and wispy and his bushy eyebrows were unkempt. It's a great description. Do I need to describe this old man to my readers? Is it important to my readers? One of the tips that I had off, I think it was Holly Lyle, is she said, if you are describing something to a reader, you are literally taking them into a room and pointing to something and then describing it to them. But there needs to be a reason why you're describing it to them. So does this old man need to be described to my readers for this scene? Do these details, are they significant to what the story I'm trying to tell? If they are not, something like, because we still want the vivid and concise details, but not to over describe it, I would say something like deep furrows mapped a lifetime of laughter and sorrow on the old man's face. His grey eyes twinkling under unruly brows. That's simple enough. We know that he's old, we know that he's got a wrinkled face, and we know that his eyebrows are wrong. Another good way of effective description is using sensory information. Engage your readers' senses to make your descriptions more vivid, and don't just rely on the visual details. This is one of my things. I tend to rely on the visual details more than anything else, and I think we all do just because they're easy. But there are 5 senses. So obviously you've got the sight, but there is sound, smell, hearing, touch and taste. So there are 5 senses that you could use to bring the reader into your story with the descriptions. Obviously don't use all 5 in one go lots of times. That's going to get a little bit tedious. Choose the most relevant details for the scene you're writing to kind of evoke the readers' emotions and make them feel and experience the scene you're trying to write. So I'll give you a quick example of this again. This is my storytelling on the fly, by the way, so if they're really rubbish, I'm sorry. I'm just kind of making them up as I go along. I work better with examples, so I figure giving you examples will also help, because I think seeing examples of things helps us to understand what we're trying to learn. So for this one, using sensory information for descriptions, a overwritten version of this would be: the beach was beautiful. The sand was warm and soft. The water was blue and clear. The sun was hot. There were seagulls flying overhead and making a noise. The air smelled salt. Again, it's such a fine, the description's fine, I think. But if we wanted to go more vivid and concise, I could say things like warm sand squeezed between her toes as the briny breeze carried... Try to say briny breeze a lot, so let's try that again. Warm sand squeezed between her toes as the briny breeze carried the rhythmic crash of waves and shrill cries of the circling gulls. That's it. It's a lot more concise, even though it was very hard to say, but it was like literally half the words. So use the sensory details, but don't go overboard with them. We don't need all 5 in every single paragraph, every single scene. That's just going to get too much. Another way is to employ strong specific language. So the power of your description often lies in your word choices. I always find it is better to use concrete and specific words. I talked about this in my showing and telling video, and I think a lot of it is kind of the same. But yeah, use concrete words rather than vague general terms. These often help to bring our descriptions right in, and often the readers don't even realise when we're using these words. I know when I'm reading, if the author is using the more concrete words, I am just sailing through the story. Whereas if they're using generalised, flowery prose things, I can really feel the story dragging in my head and kind of like slowing down, and it makes it harder to read. And I think it's something readers are kind of attuned to naturally. So one of the ways to be more concrete is to use strong verbs. So instead of saying a character was tall, you could describe a character as towering over somebody. Rather than calling a room messy in your description, you could literally say that it was cluttered with discarded takeout containers and crumpled bits of paper and clothes strewn across the bed. But strong verbs can also add a sense of vibrancy to your fiction, a sense of vibrancy to your descriptions. Instead of saying a character walked quickly, you might say that they strode, or they dashed, or they hurried. And I know this probably more goes into the same as showing not telling. It's using specific words to describe what you want instead of overwriting it, when you literally could just use a more impactful word. So for example, you know, someone ran very quickly. Ran very quickly is 3 words, where you say hurried, it's 1 word. You've used less words to say the same thing, if that makes sense. Another thing is you can integrate your descriptions with action. So one of the common mistakes I see in this, I've seen this more from editing people's work, is when people separate the description and the action, and they don't have them as a combined thing. They kind of overwrite the whole description of something, and then they put an action in, and it's like you just weight it down, and it just doesn't read right. When I tend to, you can put the things together to make such a better descriptive paragraph, and I'll give you an example of this in a minute. So for example, instead of just describing a room before your character enters it, reveal the details as your character sees them as they are moving through the room, but obviously just show all the necessary information to describe. So I'll give you another example. Again, it's just like top of my head. So the storytelling probably isn't the best, but the overwritten way would be: the kitchen was a mess. The dishes were piled in the sink. The counters were covered with empty takeout packets and crumbs. The floor was sticky. Then Sarah walked in and started cleaning. We could change that to combine those things. So we have the description of the room, and then we have what Sarah was doing. So what we could do is make that into one thing, where we're talking about what Sarah's doing as we're describing the room. So instead of all that, we could have: Sarah navigated the minefield of a kitchen, grimacing as her shoes stuck to the grimy floor. She shoved aside greasy takeout containers, sending crumbs skittering, and tackled the festering tower of dishes in the sink. So as you can see, we're moving her through the room. We don't need to say that she's cleaning the room. We can see that she's cleaning the room. We don't need to know we don't need to be told the room is messy through lots of description. We can see through her action that the room is messy, and it kind of brings it all together and makes the description of the room kind of more like an experience for the reader, rather than a list of descriptions that show us the room is messy, if that makes sense. Talked about this in my showing and telling video, is metaphors and similes. They are handy tools, but again, don't overuse them. They can create really vivid images for the reader. So similes and metaphors are places where we can really overwrite and do it to excess. So just be careful when you're using them, but they're also very handy tools. But also, when using similes and metaphors, avoid using cliches and really overly complex comparisons, because that will just totally throw your readers out. A well-chosen metaphor can really illuminate your description that resonates deeply with your reader. Just watch yourself if you find yourself stringing together metaphor after metaphor. And if you want an example of this, we could have Let's really go on the metaphors. Her voice was like honey, sweet and smooth, flowing like a gentle river. It was music to her ears, a symphony of dulcet tone that wrapped around him like a warm blanket on a cold winter's night. That is so full of cliches, but do you see what I mean? I mean, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's kind of overboard when we could just simply say her voice was honey smooth, a melody that wrapped him in warmth. Boom. Shorter, concise, to the point, and still using metaphors and similes. Also, consider the pace of your story. So the amount and the style of your descriptions will actually depend on the scene you are writing. Obviously, if you've got a high action scene, you're going to want those shorter, sharper, snappy sentences and descriptions to keep the momentum going and to make the reader feel the high stakes of the scene you're writing. Whereas slower, more contemplative scenes, you have more room for longer sentences and longer descriptions because you're just trying to slow the pace of your story down. So just try and remember that your description will often set the pace of your story and they will affect the rhythm and flow of your narrative. So if when you're probably you pick this up in editing, but if you find that your description is making the scene slow when it should be high stakes, just have a look at your descriptions and maybe you've just over described and some of that needs cutting back just to make it a little bit more sharper. And you know, for an example of a high stakes thing, we could have the bullet whizzed past, concrete exploding inches from Sarah's head. Poor Sarah. He dove, rolled and came up shooting. It's simple and we know the scene and we can imagine it. And I think Stephen King talks about this in his book on writing, where he says that description should start in the author's mind and finish in the reader's. So, for example, with that one, I didn't need to describe gun being shot. I didn't need to describe the bullet or the shooter. I just said that the bullet whizzed through the air and exploded in the concrete. I didn't need to tell you that it hit the wall. I don't need to describe that the wall was near Sarah's head. I didn't need to describe everything exploding around him. We know how fast a bullet goes. We know what it looks like when a bullet hits concrete. We've seen it in movies. We know what it's like when a character drops to the ground, rolls and then comes up aiming their gun. So I don't need to describe everything that's seen for you to be able to see it. I could just say it with that simple sentence of the bullet whizzed past, concrete exploding near Sarah's head. She dove, rolled and came up shooting. I think that's what I said. We can see that from those. So taking all the rest of the description out makes that scene a little bit faster and a little bit punchier. Another way to help with description and not overwriting is to filter your descriptions through your character's perspective. So when you put them in a scene, what would they notice in this situation? What are they paying attention to? Because it can be very tempting to put a character in a room and describe everything, but would the character actually notice those things? Or are you just trying to describe the whole picture to the reader and you don't actually need to? But also, if you do it through their perspective, how would they describe it? Because if you have, you know, it's that old saying, isn't it, that two people could go to a party, the same party, but they would both have different experiences. One would, you know, an introvert would find it noisy and loud and just want to get out there. An extrovert would find it bustling and bright and amazing. And it's the same with describing things. When you are describing through your character's perspective, you would choose words that are specific to their personality and also their current state, emotional state in the scene. And this way of doing things doesn't just help your descriptions of your story, it also helps to show readers your character's personality. So you would say in your story that the classroom was full of students sitting at desks. It's a description, it's not even overly described, it's just a description. And this is where the balance comes in, because we would put more words into this to describe this scene through our character's perspective. And we're going for Sarah again. So to Sarah, the new girl, the classroom was a sea of unfamiliar faces, some curious, some indifferent, all potential friends and foes in the battlefield of high school. So probably adding more words and using more concrete words, as I've spoke about, we can see what Sarah thinks. She's obviously joining a new school, and you know, so she's a little bit nervous. People are unfamiliar to her. She's in a new situation, and we can describe that with our description. But we did it through Sarah's perspective, which actually had an emotion to it, whereas whereas rather just saying that the students were all sitting at desks, that's just fact. It doesn't actually have an emotional weight on it. By describing the room through Sarah's eyes, we get a better idea of what that classroom is like and the teetering emotions that she might have for that situation. So go for the less is more thing. And I probably struggle on this. I'm the other way round. So I actually, when I write a first draft, it's very sparse of descriptions and I have to go in and add the description. But what I find a lot when I've been editing people's work is that they actually over describe and then we have to edit the descriptions out. And I think Stephen King again speaks about this in his On Writing book, that when he was first submitting something, he had it rejected and was told to cut it and cut it and cut it. I can't remember the facts, but it actually made it better because he cut it down and made it more concise rather than all the big descriptions. So that's one thing to consider when you're looking about describing and not overwriting, is use less words and they'll actually describe better, whereas more kind of just drowns out what you're trying to describe. Sometimes it is just the better, well-chosen words that can provide better evocative descriptions for the readers, if that makes sense. And you can trust your readers' imaginations to fill in the gap. And I won't quote Stephen King again. And for example of this is, the house was clearly abandoned. The windows were broken, the paint was peeling, the yard was overgrown, and the roof had holes in it. It looked like no one had lived there for years. It's a good description, but we can make it a bit more evocative by changing it to: a child's forgotten teddy bear lay face down on the weed-choked path, a silent testimony to the house's abandonment. It's less words, but we know a family lived there. We know no one's been there for years. It just says a lot. It just gives it more evocative language for the reader to picture that scene a lot better. Because by putting a teddy bear there, it infers there was a family here, it's laying face down, for some reason that teddy bear's been left. Did they rush? Did they go in the middle of the night? Has it dropped out of a box? There is so much more that goes into that just by having those couple of little details rather than going into overly describing everything about the house. Another tip for helping you to, especially to spot your overwriting, is to read your work aloud. If you've overwritten, when you read aloud, you may find yourself running out of breath when you're speaking your descriptions. You may find that when you're reading something it feels tedious. Reading and writing are completely different things. So what I would tend to do is I will print something off and read it aloud, and I can usually spot if something is over described because I find I skip and can't be bothered to say the descriptions I've written. So if you're worried about over describing, just try reading it because it will help you kind of spot those areas where you have over-described. But it'll also, the other way, will help you spot those areas where you've not put enough description in. And lastly, it's the editing part, and this is the bit that Stephen King talks about, is editing ruthlessly. Now I'm the opposite, like I've already said. I need to put more descriptions in. I am one of these persons that will literally put the bare bones down of a story and then I have to add the descriptions. But if that's not you and you overly describe on your first draft, then edit. Be ruthless when you're editing and don't be afraid to cut words. We all fall into this, I really like this sentence, I really like this paragraph, and we don't cut it. But if it is over description, your readers aren't going to appreciate it. I was reading a book recently, and it's actually a published book, and one of the things that drove me nuts is they would tell me something and then they would repeat it and then they would describe it, and I was like, so much of this could be cut out, it's unnecessary. They just kept repeating themselves, and I do that a couple of times in my description. So just, things like, look for where you repeat yourself, look where you have unnecessary adverb, and look where you are describing things that don't actually matter to the story or to the scene you're trying to portray. Those are some of the places that you could edit out the over description. Remember that every word should earn its place in your book. If a descriptive passage isn't adding to your story's atmosphere or developing your characters or moving your plot forward, then it probably doesn't need to be there. So consider cutting it or revising it. Just edit it, and don't be afraid to get rid of it if it doesn't work. I hope these tips have helped. Writing vivid descriptions is one of those things that we develop over time, and it's a balancing act really that, just like anything, needs practice. All of writing is practice. We need to practice what we're doing, describing, showing, not telling, all that stuff. So don't be too harsh on yourself if you don't get this right at the beginning, because you will learn, and eventually I think you kind of get an intuitive feel for how much description needs to go into a scene. But just quick recap, remember to use significant details, use all 5 senses but effectively, don't overuse them, choose strong words, strong, concrete words to describe. Don't forget to integrate some of your descriptions in with the actions of your characters, and by doing these you can create powerful imagery that enhances your story without overwhelming your readers, which is the point. And just remember that actually the goal of description is not to paint a complex picture for your readers, but it's to provide enough detail that it sparks your readers' imagination and actually puts them into the story. You're not trying to drown them with words. You're just trying to give them enough information that they will experience the story as if they're in it. But as with all techniques in writing, the number one thing that I will always say to anybody is practice. Practice, practice, practice. You know, you wouldn't expect a musician to get on stage and get their song correct, you know, whether they're playing the guitar or playing the piano. Even if they have been at this for years, they still practice behind the scenes. They still go for feedback. They're still continually trying to refine their skills. And it is the same with a writer. Don't think that if you don't get descriptions right first time and that you're still overwriting, that there is something wrong with you and you're just rubbish at this. No, you just need to practice and keep all these tips that I've given you in mind to just help to get your descriptions more concise on the page and not to overwrite them for the readers. Anyway, I hope this helped in helping you to understand descriptions and not overwriting. If you have any questions, pop them down in the comments and I will get back to you. I'm sorry about the crappy lighting, but it is what it is. I wanted to make sure to get the video recorded, so I'm going to leave this here and head off and get back to the writing myself. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel and give that notification bell a subscribe because it all helps me. As I always say, I have a small little group that I'm trying to grow. The link is down below. It is just to chat about writing, anything writing. You're welcome to come and join. I also have my mailing list down below where I give you all my free resources and let you know every time I upload a video. I don't spam you. I probably have literally sent like 2 emails out in the year of having this mailing list, so just join. It does give you access to things like character sheets and plotting workbooks and things like that for free. So until next time, I shall leave that here. Happy writing and bye for now.